Vayirdefu Mitzrayim achareim vayasigu oisam choinem alayom. The Egyptians chased down the Israelites. It seems like this entire incredible narrative of Moshe Rabbeinu leading the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim with the Almighty's incredible wonders and the 10 destructive and berating plagues, it seems like it will all be for naught. As Paro and his riders and his warriors, they gather themselves up and they encamp by the sea near Pi Hachiros, that is right before Baal Tzefon. It seems like they are gaining on them. Uparo hikriv. They are. Va'isu b'nei Yisrael eseineim, and the Jewish people, they raise their eyes. They look over their shoulders. Vehineim, behold, Mitzrayim nosei achareim. They're gaining on us. They're getting closer. Vayiru me'od vayitzoaku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem. And they became overcome with dread. They were greatly frightened, and they cried out to God. Pasuk Yud Gimel, Vayomer el Moshe Mablian Kvarim b'Mitzrayim. In a strange turn of events, the Dordea begins a bit of blasphemous sarcasm. Moshe, was it that there weren't enough graves to have our Levios and be buried back in Egypt? Is it that you brought us out to the wilderness to die? Mazos hasiso lanu lo tzianu miMitzrayim. Sharp, biting, and rather hard to digest words from the Dordea. But allow me to direct your attention to an incredible Rashi here. Rashi on Dibur Maschil Vayitzoaku b'nei Yisrael el Hashem, that they cried out to God. Zokt, the holy Rashi. Rabban shel Yisrael. Tofsu umnes avosam. What is it that they were crying out for? What was encompassed within it? Why did they do it? Rashi taking care of perhaps many different bits of tension in the pasuk. They were grabbing onto the profession of their fathers. Avraham hu omer el hamokom asher omad sham. We know Avraham Avinu cried out in prayer. Ein amida el lashon tefillah. We know that Yitzchak, the great patriarch Lasuach Basada, installed mincha into Judaism. Sicha lashon tefillah, and Yaakov vayivka ba'makom. He bumped into the place, and a pagia is a lashon of tefillah. Zok the holy mirror mashkiach. Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz, the great spiritual dean of Yeshivas Mir during the Roaring Twenties, he points out to us an incredible and rather novel insight that one may miss when reading this Rashi. Rashi calls our vayitzoaku, our crying out, our prayer, an umnis, a career choice, a career path, our line of work, our profession, our trade, our job. A Jewish person, when he wakes up in his day and commutes back and forth, his job is prayer. His umnis that he inherited from his forefathers is tefillah. Rabbi Yerucham points out, in the way that, in his classic style he does, that tailors a needle and thread with them, a chayit, a shoemaker keeps his owl, this funky curved tool to punch holes in leather, with him. He keeps it, does the shoemaker, and learns how to use it because that's his umnus. And a Jew, what is it that he wakes up to do? What is it that is his sacred tools at the trade? It is tefillah. It is prayer. It is his siddur. It is praying and crying out to God. That's what we do as Jews. It's really a tale as old as time, as this Fortune 500 company was really created by Avraham Avinu. He installed for us that we daven, that vayitzaku el Hashem, that we cry out to God. Yitzchak followed. And just like my grandfather was a doctor, and my great-grandfather was a doctor, and eventually my father was a doctor, I'm a doctor. And I pray, because I'm a part of the company. Vayitzoaku, Klal Yisrael channeled their inner DNA, and they bought into this profession that they have learned from the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Prayer is an occupation. But there's something else that Rabbi Yerucham points out, that the rayas, the proofs of where we find the lashon of vayitzaku to be a grabbing on to the tools of the trade and the profession that is prayer that our forefathers utilized. It's being applied right here at a time when there's ultimate distress. There's ultimate lachatz. There's ultimate fear and dread. And after being overcome with emotion, they cried out, Ashrei Yoshvei Veisecha Oide Halalucha Sela. They cried out, Baruch es Hashem HaMevorach and Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. They cried out in prayer as they learned from their forefathers. Rabbi Yerucham shows to us is that if this is to be a true raya, and clearly what Rashi's getting at, is that we also get a look, Alishar, we get a look over the wall into what the Shachras, Mincha, and Marav looked like when our forefathers davened. Their Mincha was mitaych min ameitza karasika. It was mitaych boirei oilam, I need you, Tata and Himmel. The men of incredible strength and incomprehensible dveikus to the boirei oilam, their tefillah. You can imagine how powerful it was if it actually became installed into Shulchan Aruch for all of time, for every Jew to daven 3 times a day. A chiddush here of that. Just imagine the crying Jewish people on the shores of the Yam Suf. They learned that. Tefillah, how that should look, from the Mincha, from the Marav of the Avos. The truth that the Boirei Olam was really in search and was misaveh for this type of tefillah. Shmos Rabbah, Chaf Aleph Hey. Look it up. It tells us that the Boirei Olam was actually misaveh for this type of tefillah, of a minametzar karasi ka anoni ba merchav ka type of tefillah, a tefillah miteich lachatz. Because, quote, from Shmos Rabbah, Chaf Aleph Hey, Hashmi'eni es koilech oisei hakol shekvar shamati b'Mitzrayim. I wish that the Jews would cry out to me like they did in Egypt. The Medrash shows us, Rashi quotes it in one of his comments on our Parsha, that Hashem actually orchestrated the event so that there would be some more lachatz, because Hashem craved, longed, and had a hankering, kaviyachol, for the prayer mitoch lachatz, a menametzar type of prayer. So he set us up between the water and the Mitzrim, our bloodthirsty taskmasters chasing us down, because it seems Hashem was not misaveh for our half-hearted, or perhaps less than pain-filled and pressure-induced Shachris, Mincha, and Marivs. We know this concept, that God wants to hear us in this type of direct connection. God pains the righteous, pains the mothers, gives Sarif Garachov Leah infertility because he was misaveh for their prayer. It's this type of umness. It's this profession that tefillah is for the Jew. I get to witness this every single day. I'm in a dating chabura. I watch the Bachram continue to plug away and learn the sugyas of Cheskas Abatim, about why one needs to have a claim along with his chazaka sheyeshi motaina, while traveling to and from distant locations trying to find their zivug. But when they stay for mincha, after shir, I get a glimpse of what somebody who's standing on the edge of a large life decision, what it is that he looks like in prayer. Please, Bayrei Olam, I need this shidduch to go through. Please, Bayrei Olam, hear my tefillah. All my friends are getting married and I'm stuck here in the mud. Please, Bayrei Olam, a tefillah mitoich lachatz I get to witness. And it's Eina Daima from somebody that prays with a stone-hearted, half-hearted, chapping a mincha, rather unkavana-filled prayer. Vayitzaku tafsu shel avosam. That's what happened at the Yam Suf. The approach number 2 to this Rashi is far less encouraging, far less peachy keen, hunky-dory, and rainbows and butterflies, but much more dark, sharp, rebuke-filled, and may we even say filled with chastisement and rebuke. So feel free to pause, turn off, fast forward, or do what you like. But you have been forewarned. And the approach is not mine. The approach is coming from the great Gur Aryeh, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy of Prague, the holy Maharal mi Prague, 1548 to 1578. In his super commentary on Rashi, every word is gold, and he flips the entire idea on its head. What does Rashi mean by tafsu umnes avosam? De'en lomar shayu tzoakim kederech hatzadikim shehem tzoakim be'eis tzara. It cannot mean that they cried out like the righteous. It cannot mean something good that they grabbed onto the umnes. It cannot be positive. So how you mislonin achshav, because we find that they're complaining. Well, there are not enough kivarim. Loimer halo tov lanu avodas mitzrayim. Why'd you take us out here, Moshe? Clearly, the nation is bemoaning the fact. They are melancholic, perhaps even a bit depressed. So it must be that they grabbed onto an umnes that is rather less than adequate. Ella. Zok the Maharal shahayu umnes avosam. Shekach hayam minag avosam. This is what the forefathers did. V'davar shu minag avosam, nimshach ha'adam tamid acharav. And if it's the minag avosenu b'yodenu, they did it, so we do it. Aval gav, she'ena osa bekavana libo v'daito. Even though this generation, the Dardeya, they did not do it with their heart, but they did it because that's what Daddy did. The Maharal learns that Rashi is really bothered here by the fact of their tzaku el Hashem, they cry out to God, but then they continue to complain. They show a lack of faith, a lack of emunah. So it seems to be totally contradicting itself. A stira mineu bey, a tarta desasri. How is it that they're vayitzaku, vayitzoaku el Hashem, and then they are misloining him, they're complaining, lacking faith? That, says the Maharal, is what's coming. That is what Rashi is coming to do. That they did technically pray. Because that's what a Jew does. But they did not feel it. It was not Einai Oise Bekavonas Liboy V'daito. They did it because this is the minhag. They did it in a very mechanical, motorized, uninvolved, forgery, replication type of prayer. Is that, I remember my dad used to come home and watch the news, even though I don't care about the news yet, but that's what Dad did, so I'll come home and watch the news. It's a bad mushal, but hopefully you get the drift. The Jews prayed here, even though they did not necessarily feel it in their hearts, as is clear from their forthcoming actions. But the truth is that they just acted out of rote, out of minhag, because that's how Dad used to act. But the sorry truth, Maharal tells us, is that the forefathers, they davened with kavana, they davened with liboy, with leiv. But here, it was a copying job. And that's how it all makes sense as to why they went complaining in the future psukim. The Maharal continues with something so sharp, but before we explain that raya, it should shock you and should bother you and should also kind of provoke you, this idea that there's something unsatisfactory, something that needs improvement by just acting out the mitzvos without doing them with heart. The Maharal, he shocks us by telling us that if you daven and you follow in the ways of the Fortune 500 company of the Umna Shel Avosam, and you do it because Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov davened, that is still needing improvement. If you're going to daven hard, but then leave the shul and go act out, not in accordance with how you have prayed and trusted in davening. It can be likened to a person. If this idea is hard for you to understand, If somebody who is so badly in need of funds, he needs to pay his rent and his mortgage, let's put it, his $4,000 in his bank account says $100. He needs money and he goes into shul and he davens because God said you got to daven. But because I know that my dad, when he needed money, he would go and he would daven. But you don't actually understand what tefillah is, what it represents, what its value is, but you merely go through the mechanical actions of prayer before running out of shul, and then you continue to rob, steal, and cheat to do whatever you can to find the money because you are misleading him, you're complaining. But how is it that you prayed it's a stira? No, it's not a stira. It's just we go through the actions of what God asks us to do and what our grandparents used to do, but we do it without our minds and hearts attached. Tafsu umnis shalavosam. Minagavosenu biyadenu. From the dark side of the moon. The Maharal tells us, citing a Gemara in Chulin, if you want to see an example of this concept, the Gemara is talking about what's the halacha of a heretic should shecht. Is it rendered treif? What status of treif? And the Gemara eventually comes out. Are there those that serve avodah zarah and chutz la'aretz? Maybe there's a rove, and maybe we'll have to passel all the shchita of roiv oivdei kaychavim, and we'll go basar roiv, and therefore it is treif. Before Amar Rabbi Yerucham, nachrem shebechutza la'aretz lav oivdei avodas kaychavim. Rabbi Yerucham tells us that most oived koichavim are actually not oived avodah zarah. Ella minog avosehem biyaldenam. Rather, they go to church, they bow down to idols, but it is not out of faith and devotion to their idols. They are not deemed baalei avodah zarah, but rather it is just the passing down of the traditional custom of their ancestors that was transmitted to them, and therefore they are not called baalei avodah zarah and oived koichavim, because their hearts and minds are not attached to it. They're just following of what their grandparents used to do. How chilling is that? That the Maharal attaches that here to the nation standing by the Yam Suf. Tafsu umnish alavos, and they prayed. But they went right off to complain because they were just merely mimicking Yaakov's Amida, Yitzchak's Lasuach. I listened to recently, actually really shedded a lot of dark light upon this topic. A recent podcast that's forthcoming from a really smart person who interviews people that have been through traumatic divorces to try to figure out why it is that so many couples seem to be separating themselves from each other and divorcing each other. And sometimes it happens even within a week or even within 2 months. What exactly goes on? How can we stop this? And how can we kind of make a social gathering to make people feel not so alone and even come up with some more information to solve the problem? And in the very first interview, the person being interviewed, who shall obviously remain nameless, mentioned that it was actually a very peace-filled divorce. It was simply that one person, her spouse, was practicing orthopraxy instead of Judaism. I wrote this word down. It's a hard one to say, and I wasn't sure exactly what it meant until I looked it up. The person also elaborated upon the topic. But apparently, her husband had gone orthoprax. What that means is that he was practicing religion, Torah, Judaism, in the correct conduct, both ethical and liturgical. But in their heart, did not buy in. They could not get behind the grace, the faith. But they were too embarrassed in this situation to stop acting as such. And it was a horrible situation. Probably some poor choices made by some educators of this fellow. But that's not for today's discussion. But what is for today's discussion is that how scary is it? that there's been a name given to mindless, half-hearted, stone-hearted service of God. A tefillah of a tafsu shel umnus shel avosam, a grabbing onto the avodah. How many of us can honestly say that we are not guilty at some level of orthopraxy? Orthopraxy? However to say it. But acting because, of course, Dad didn't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, so I don't. Do I know why, how, or what? I know that Dad davens 3 times a day, but do I know the priceless value of tefillah? I know that Dad, he has his chavrusa. You have to learn in the morning, and he did daf yomi. But with the proper conduct, but without heart. If it's merely a grabbing of what your grandparents used to do, you're either orthopraxy, in the slightest bit, or God forbid, some elements of conservative, of reform, of trying to mimic in some way and keep alive some old sacred tradition of Judaism. But it's so mistaken and so sad because Judaism is vibrant and beautiful and fully alive in all of its effervescent colors today and now, and is for each Jewish person to understand it and to ask those very same questions that his grandparents asked and get to the same clarity that you and your grandparents got to, and to ponder the great creations of the world like Avraham Avinu, because Judaism is not supposed to be an impartial exercise. It is supposed to be a study. It is supposed to be a searching. My Rabbein would always tell me, in a rather facetious way, I beg of you, you take it the proper way, but don't trust Rashi. What did they mean? Look it up for yourself. See if you learn it the same way. How do you understand the Gemara or the Pasuk? And then compare your notes with Rashi and see why he's correct, why he learned that way, and why he disregarded your approach. But be inquisitive. Be insightful. Be growth-seeking. Come to the truth by your own right. Don't answer or say or mimic or barf out what your parents told you. Don't merely grab the career of your dad. Be a doctor, not because your grandparents were doctors and your dad was a doctor, but because you have a tremendous interest in medicine, in large profits, and helping people. That's the dark side of the tafsu umnus avosam. Our lesson here today is that, number one, your tefillah should be bitoch lachatz, with a screaming out, pressure-filled, pressure-induced, menametzar karosiyah type of tefillah, because that is how the Avos prayed. And on the other side, the flip side, how is it that the Jewish people prayed but then seemed to act without total faith when they complained that there were not enough graves in Egypt? That's because the way the Maharal learns Rashi, their tefillah was mechanical, phony, computerized, and without heart, but merely just a mimicking of what their grandparents used to do. And that is not how you pray. Because it's an avodah shebelev, it's a prayer, it's a service that happens in the heart. Choose to act after educating yourself and internalizing the worth, the richness, the uniqueness of tefillah, of avodah. Choose to understand the unending value and glory and beauty of being Jewish. Educate yourself about the depth of Torah and the depth of tefillah. Daven from your heart because you understand the value of it. And that's because that's what one does. That's his profession, that I wake up and I daven. And I daven with fervor and passion because I know that's what a Jew does, is he cries out to the master of the world. Let us stop copying what Dad and Grandpa did. We should cry out to God because we know He is the only one that has the ability to help us and save us. And we should specifically daven, like the Maharal tells us, that we should do it bekavonas libay v'daito, with our entire heart and entire mind, because that is the brilliant inheritance that we have inherited from avosam, from our fathers.
Kilam kedoshim